equitable open science practices. So do stay tuned. There's this one in October. There's going to be another in December, focusing a little bit more in on Open Research Europe. And then we're also going to have some talks at the beginning of 2024 in collaboration with PLUS. So one of the goals here is to kind of give people who are interested some background in these topics. And then next year we'll be forming some more close-knit working groups to actually work through some of these ideas. So again, next month, if you're able to join us, we're going to have a slightly different talk from Tim Parker talking about reproducibility in science. But today we have Becky Hill with us from F1000. Becky Hill is a strategic partnership manager at F1000, where she works to develop open research publishing partnerships. She's particularly interested in the development and implementation of open science globally. Prior to working at F1000, she was a portfolio manager and managing editor at Taylor & Francis and a publishing executive at Maney Publishing. Today, Becky will be providing an overview of how scholarly publishers can support researchers, institutions, and funders in their open research pursuits. And after her talk, we hope to have an interactive discussion. So please do keep track of any questions or comments you might have. A lot of times our sessions go a little bit longer, to 45 to 50 minutes, and we kind of run out of time for discussion. So Becky's really made it a point to keep her talk a little bit shorter because she's really interested in F1000, really interested in hearing from the perspective of those in the room today. So please do jot down any comments or questions that come to mind as Becky's speaking. And with that, thank you, Becky, so much for joining us, and I'll let you take the stage.
Thank you very much, Tasha, for that introduction, and really lovely to be here today and talk to you all. I appreciate you sharing your Friday lunchtimes, mornings, afternoons with me. I know that's no mean feat. Perfect. There's always that inevitable technological challenge at the beginning of these things, but it seems like we've got there relatively pain-free. So yes, I'm here today. Hello, everybody. Really lovely to meet you all, talk to you all. And yes, the topic of my discussion today is what are publishers doing to enable open science? This is a really broad topic. As you might imagine, lots of different publishers might have slightly different stances or ideas or perspectives on this. And I'm really kind of coming to this from my own perspective, and particularly from the perspective of an open research publisher, that is F1000. So I will be giving some examples from F1000 today about what we're doing, but I'd also be talking more broadly about what I think publishers can do in general to enable open science, with some examples from other publishers too. And as Tasha said, there'll be loads of time for questions, comments, feedbacks at the end. Anything, really lovely to hear from you. So please do pop that in the chat or just raise your hand at the end. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that part of it. So without further ado, this is what I'm going to cover today. Firstly, I will start with a quick introduction of F1000 in case you're unfamiliar with us, and hopefully this will help to demonstrate why open science is such an important area for us as a publisher. And then I will spend a little bit of time on some reflections on the drivers and value of open science. And I know that many of you in the room will be experts on open science. You are coming to a webinar series about open science, so I don't mean in any way to kind of define or teach your grandma to suck eggs. Sorry, that's a really English phrase. But I think it's worth spending a bit of time on that broader context, because that directly informs what publishers do. So hopefully you'll bear with me on that bit. And then I will talk about more specifically what publishers are doing in this space, with some examples from F1000 and other publishers, and generally thinking about what publishers could do to further enable open science. And then I will finish on some of the challenges, and it would be remiss of me not to talk about some of the things that publishers are facing and other stakeholders across the research system are facing when it comes to the adoption of open science, because as we know, it's not necessarily a very simple nor easy transition. And there are definitely things in the way that we need to kind of think about. And the one primarily that I'll be thinking about in this section is research integrity, and thinking about some of the challenges that publishers are facing there. And then I will go on to the Q&A section, so there'll be plenty of time for discussion then. So very quickly, and firstly, to introduce you to F1000, in case you haven't come across us before, we're a scholarly publisher. We were launched in 2013, so we're relatively new in the grand scheme of scholarly publishers, and it's our 10th anniversary this year. And we were launched in 2013 to really rethink and offer something new when it came to scholarly dissemination, to design a model that meant that research could be used and have value and be as transparent as possible. And in 2013, we launched what we called our open research publishing model. And I should say here, I am using the terms open research and open science interchangeably to mean a similar thing. But what we mean by our open research publishing model is that it's comprised of the four things that I've got here. Firstly, open access. That is the foundation block in everything we do. Everything we publish is open access with permissive licenses, CC BY, largely CC BY 4.0, which enables use, reuse, and attribution. But really, what we're doing intends to go beyond that. So it's beyond just open access, but that is a really important part. And the ways we go beyond that is firstly with open data. We have a mandatory open data policy, but also we enable sharing of other research objects like software and code in an open way. The peer review process that we have is completely open too, invited and transparent, and it happens after publication. So it's a bit like a preprint plus that peer review validation and then the indexing and dissemination. We have a real range of article types that we support across our various venues, and these are designed to support researchers across career stages, especially early career researchers, which I know are going to be a key part of this organisation and this discussion today, but also through a variety of roles, including non-traditional research roles as well, across subjects, etc. I'll come back to that one, so there'll be more information about that. We publish a range of venues, mostly all sound science, all broad scope, and all multidisciplinary within certain parameters. And we work in partnership with a number of research organisations who share our ambitions and aspirations when it comes to open and open science. And I have a few examples of those later, which I'll talk about. F1000 was acquired by Taylor and Francis in 2020. And with them, we offer a real range of open options across the spectrum for researchers to share their work with us. And finally, we are a signatory of DORA. Many of you are familiar with DORA, but just in case, that's the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. And F1000's managing director is actually on the board of DORA, and we see everything that we do as being in step with their own aims and ambitions too. So we see ourselves as an enabler of responsible research evaluation and metrics. And I'll come back to that as well as one of the things that publishers can do. So on to the next section and some reflections on the drivers and value of open science. And this is really just the broader context to set the scene, I guess. And as I said at the beginning, I know many of you are experts on open science in this room, and I am by no means here to tell you what open science is. But I think it's useful to include this definition as a sort of starting point. There are lots of definitions of open science. I think this one from the UNESCO recommendation on open science, published a few years ago now, is a really useful one to set some context, partly because it's become a bit of an industry reference and touchstone, but also because they're such a truly global organisation that I think it really helps to demonstrate that wider context, and which seems to be actively promoting a global drive towards open science. And I'm not going to read through everything here, but I think it's worth kind of reflecting on what I think the essence of this here really is, which is about how open, transparent, and inclusive research practices can bring efficiencies across the research system, but also in turn can bring about broader developmental, human, societal, and economic progress. And in the case here, they've used the example of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but I think it's much broader than that too. And this is really a systems definition, which requires system-wide thinking to enable it and to make this happen. And that's collaboration across all of the different parts and players in the whole of the research system, which publishers are one, but not the only one at all. But thinking about the role of publishers particularly, I've picked out this particular bit from the report, which talks about making, and it's interesting, we were talking about multilingual before, and this does include that sort of mandate for multilingual nature as well, but making scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. And this, in essence, is about discoverability and access. And this is really where I think publishers have a really key role to play in making sure that that research that is being shared in an open manner is as discoverable as possible. And that's the focus that I'm going to look at over the next section of the presentation. So when it comes to that drive to discoverability and drive to open science, we see there as being many pushers and pull factors for researchers like yourselves, but also for research organisations and for different bodies within this area. And again, much that I'm going to say here will be familiar to you. I'll be saying things that you know about, but I think it helps to sort of give us that backdrop. So firstly, one of the major push factors for open science adoption have been advances in policy imperatives and funder mandates on a global basis. And as you know, many of these aim to maximise the potential for research to be used and have value. And where they are a publicly funded organisation, for example, deliver return on investment on taxpayer funding to enable that further generation, that further impact on development, growth, economic development, etc. This is where Plan S come in, UNESCO and the OSTP memo that came out last year are really driving change, as many of you know. Alongside this, we've also seen the emergence of services and new ways of doing research, largely driven by technology, but also through a demand to really revisit and refresh old ways of working and offer something new for researchers that adds value into the way research can be shared today. And that's really where F1000 sits. We want to rethink how research can be shared and published to maximise the potential for the use and reuse of research. But it's also where open access sits and lots of offerings sit there. So lots of publishers, PLOS, eLife, Centre of Open Science, we see as similar operators here, but also preprints, research infrastructure services, analytics. And these can all be big pull factors because they might be offering a new way of sharing research. It might be faster, it might be more discoverable, or it might be in a way that gives researchers more credit. And these are all kind of a big pull factor, I think, in the mix of the backdrop of funder mandates. And then, of course, alongside this, there is the very well discussed benefits of sharing work openly, which I'm sure I don't need to convince lots of you of. I'm not going to talk through, but I think this infographic from JISC, the UK consortia, does quite a concise job of doing that. And these can be both push and pull factors for organisations and researchers when it comes to driving change towards open. But this is not the whole picture. In many ways, one of the most influential in driving forward uptake and engagement when it comes to open science is how researchers are incentivised and rewarded in their daily practice of research. And this is where research culture, research assessment, and research evaluation really come in and have that key role in facilitating open science. And as many of you will know, change has been relatively slow on this front. And up until now, one of the main currencies in how researchers and research are being assessed have been bibliometrically driven or based upon where that research is published. So things like the impact factor really come into play here, which have been widely discussed and shown to be problematic, but I don't really have time to go into that today, but I think it's a given in lots of circumstances. But things are changing, and we're seeing initiatives popping up on a global basis, which really are designed to revisit how we assess research and researchers. And two of those are listed here, DORA, which have come from a US context, but is global, as I've mentioned already, and COARA in the European context. And crucially, these share many attributes, but also include a focus on research practices and governance that are really central to open science, whether that's sharing work openly, sharing open data, different objects, or seeing a more holistic view of research. And essentially the things that we see that's interesting, that's useful for publishers too, the elements that these share is really a drive towards a more holistic view of research outputs. So beyond just a research article, for example, or a focus primarily on publications, but different ways that research could be validated and shared, but also a move away from quantitative-based journal metrics like the impact factor, which have been widely discussed as flawed, a move towards more responsible use of metrics, and then also essentially creating a research culture that is conducive to the kind of research that they want to see in this research reform, which is great. But the challenge is really how to make that change happen, how to get the information we need to make decisions based upon this. And also for a publisher, what can publishers do to help in this mission? So that brings me on quite neatly into what publishers are trying to do and can do to enable open science against this very complex backdrop that's happening across the world. So firstly, if I go back to the UNESCO definition that I mentioned at the beginning, this infographic on the right of the screen is from that, and it includes a central pillar of open science on open scientific knowledge. And this provides quite a useful checklist or things that publishers can do to enable open scientific knowledge. And I'll go into each of them here. So firstly, offering open access routes to publication with permissive licenses for use and reuse. That's central. That's the kind of key thing that we can do. But also, we can create open data policies and facilitate open sharing of research objects, including software and code. So that's a thing that publishers are starting to do that is not necessarily fundamentally been part of the publishing process before. Things like software and code are increasingly being shared, as I've said, but working with organizations like CodeOcean, who enable widgets on a research article or a different type of peer-reviewed article, where the code can be reproduced, replicated, and run, and people can actually interact with that, which is essential for reproducibility. I would also add to this list open peer review, which I think helps to provide credit and visibility for the role of the reviewer. And again, when you're in your early stages of your career, that can be a really good way of showing the profile, showing the work that you've done as a researcher, which often is hidden when it comes to peer review. The second big thing that publishers can do is, in line with Cora and Doara's call for this move to a more holistic view of research outputs, enable a diversity of research outputs to be shared. And I'll go into this one more after this slide. And again, Dora and Koara are both very clear about the move away from quantitative-based journal metrics. And so publishers absolutely can use research metrics responsibly. And again, I'll have some examples of this after this slide. And it's all well and good as publishing that content, but it's on us to enable discoverability of those research objects using persistent identifiers, using industry standards mechanisms to make sure that that research can not only be found, but discovered and shared. And that's right back to that kind of discoverability thing that I spoke about at the beginning. And then key to this, collaboration and partnerships are key. We can't do this in silos. It needs to be done in step with other parts of the research system across the board. And so this is another one that I will focus on, the way that publishers can build partnerships to drive forward open science. So those are the three that I'm going to look at over the next couple of slides. So hopefully you'll bear with me. And as I say, I wanted to focus on a few elements, and this is the first, and that's that idea of publishing a diversity of research articles and objects and ensuring they're discoverable. At F1000, and this is an infographic from F1000, we provide a unique and wide range of article options across all of our publishing venues, which are designed to enable researchers working across career stages, as I said at the beginning, from early career to more established in their career, in a diversity of roles, in large and small teams, to share their research in formats that is appropriate to them and in ways that can make that research more usable, more reproducible, and more accessible. And it's worth saying that lots of publishers are moving in this direction too. offering data notes, method articles, registered reports as article types, for example. So this is not just F1000, but I'm using this because this is what we have. And the aim here is really to provide authors with that ability to share and publish all parts of the research journey to reduce that research waste that happens, and no matter what the result too. So at F1000, we will publish negative, null, and incremental research too, which I know has often been disincentivized with publication bias towards positive results traditionally. And so these are the kind of ways that we're trying to remedy some of those ongoing issues. The second thing that I want to cover is that responsible use of metrics that DORA and GYA, but DORA particularly, is very clear about. And I'm going through here some of the DORA recommendations for publishers from their website to really think about the tangible things that we can do. Or as I've already mentioned, DORA make a really clear recommendation to greatly reduce the emphasis on the journal impact factor as a promotional tool. And it has been really widely discussed and researched the flaws and limitations of this metrics, which is another webinar in itself. But some of these reports that I've got images of here, the Metric Tide, the Leiden Manifesto, they do a much better job in kind of really deep diving into why impact factors and those quantitative-based metrics have been problematic in research assessment. So instead, what DORA asks publishers to do is to make available a range of article level metrics and encourage that shift towards assessment based on the intrinsic value of the research rather than the place it's been published, which makes sense. And so some examples of what publishers are doing in line with this is an example from Embo Press, where they will promote article level metrics, but also journal level metrics in line with the DORA recommendations. So here they show a citation range, for example, rather than things like the mean, which is what the impact factor is calculated on and can easily be skewed. At F1000, we only offer article level metrics, and we are not the only publisher to do this. PLOS have been very pioneering in this space too. And the idea is to provide real-time article-based metrics, which give an insight into how that piece of research has been read, used, shared in many different forms. And this is really supported by things like alt metrics, which are used across the industry. And then DORA goes a step further to encourage responsible authorship practices and the provision of information about the specific contribution of each author. So this is where things like the credit taxonomy comes in, and this is something we use across all of our venues on F1000. So if you look at the author list here, and I know that articles can have much longer author lists than this, what the credit taxonomy does is expand upon what each of those individual authors have done as part of that piece of research. And this is really great for some of the aims of open science because it will give credit and recognition to those individual roles, but also highlight some of the often hidden roles in research, whether it might be data curation or software design. These things are called out and given the recognition that they deserve as part of this. And it's not a long list of people where you don't know which researcher did what. And then the third thing in terms of what publishers can do to enable open science is really in building partnerships and collaborating with other parts of the research system. As a publisher, it's really important that we make sure we stay connected to the rest of the ecosystem through collaborations and partnership, and to ensure that what we do best serves the needs of researchers and we're not just kind of innovating in a silo and delivering things that people don't need or aren't conducive to good research. And this is all publishers and not just F1000. We've got some of our partners listed down the side here. But key to this is really listening and adapting. This is quite a changing environment, I think, in the history of academic publishing. It's probably one of the times of biggest change. We really need to kind of stay connected and adapt to what people need and to what is needed for the future. And with that, reposition, rethink, and think about what new offerings we can present. These are some of the things we're thinking about, but this is a list that evolves all of the time. And I'll give you a sense over the next couple of slides of some of the partnerships that we have at F1000 and how they came about and what they're really designed to do. So the first is Open Research Europe. And I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on this because I know that there is a dedicated session on Open Research Europe, as Tasha said, at the end of the year. So this is just a very small taster for something bigger that you can look forward to later in the year. And this is an example of F1000 as a publisher providing a service to a funding agency, in this case, the European Commission, who wanted really specific things from a publishing process, but who also especially wanted to deliver against their open access, open data, and open research requirements for researchers. So they'd put out this big mandate about open access and data, and any of the researchers who were funded by them had to comply. And they thought, well, we'll create this place that people can publish and immediately be compliant. So this is a platform that any researchers who are funded by Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe can publish without charge to them. The European Commission will cover that article processing charge. And for the European Commission, this was important, as I say, aligned to their policy imperatives. It was also a cost-effective route into open access. And it's a diamond of sorts, and I've put that inverted commas model, as we're trying to remove the burden from authors to publish in an open way. But we know that there's been lots of discussion about what constitutes a diamond journal, and because there's eligibility criteria on this, there's questions over that. But it's really trying to remove that cost burden. The European Commission were also really interested in experimentation around open and transparency, and so this came with this new way of working in the open research model that F1000 offers. And again, for them, it was a way to reduce research waste. All of that research that happens and a tiny proportion of it gets published, they wanted to provide a place where people could publish all types of outputs and provide that return on investment for them. The second partnership I've got an example of here is Open Research Africa. So this is obviously outside of the European context. This was launched in 2022 and previously was the African Academy of Sciences platform. And the decision was made in partnership with the AAS to broaden this eligibility out to cover many more partners in Africa, with the aim to enable rapid and discoverable sharing of research, so that use and reuse of African research can be raised for the benefit of all. We work closely with the Science for Africa Foundation on this platform, and we're really looking at a multi-stakeholder model to support this. So again, it's quite a different example of working in partnership to enable open science in different contexts. And then the final example of partnerships before I go into the next section is this one with Icarus. And this is on F1000 Research, which is the first platform that F1000 launched. And on that, we have spaces for organizations who want to experiment with open science, where they can create their own hub, if you like, and publish some articles there. And that's what we've done with Icarus, who are a Canadian not-for-profit open science endeavour, who are undertaking high throughput, systematic antibody validation for commercially available antibodies and for all human proteins. So essentially what they're trying to do is publish antibody validation reports with us, which are a bit like data notes, and they're short articles which provide the results of the validation studies, which is essentially how an antibody performs for a certain protein, but without that detailed analysis. And this is really all about, at the centre of this, it's all about reproducibility and reducing research waste, wanting to get this information out there so other researchers can use it and build upon it, and it's not being kind of lost in the ether of things. But this also allows the group who are doing this research to get formal credit and recognition for their work, working with collaborators as well. So they're interested in kind of thinking about other types of articles to discuss broader issues of research waste and the replication crisis. But obviously there's going to be a high volume of articles coming through here. And so one thing we've also had to do is experiment with the peer review and pilot a new peer review approach. And so what we're doing with this particular partnership is piloting a peer review pool where reviewers who have certain expertise can opt into this to review a couple of articles a year at a certain time frame. And they will need to have the expertise, but it's quite an interesting experiment that we're running there. So, for example, if there's anyone on the call who has expertise with the techniques involved here, such as Western blot, and you're interested in participating, let us know. It's a great way for early career researchers to build their review profile as well. So yeah, interested to hear from you on that if there's anyone who that's of interest to. So the last section of my presentation is going to be thinking about the challenges that are facing the broader system when it comes to open science, and publishers in particularly. Research integrity is an increasing issue and has been really increasing over recent years for us to tackle. So this is a highly complex system, as I've mentioned already. There's lots going on from lots of different drivers, from lots of different angles, and there'll inevitably be challenges in the road on that adoption to open science. And when it comes to open science, we see there as being quite an interesting two sides to the coin, where that global drive to open science that I spoke about at the beginning can be seen against a backdrop of a rise in increasingly complex research integrity issues, which are often intrinsically linked to some of the drivers to open. It's a really complex picture, and it's not simply cause and effect, but it is part of the picture. And this is an issue that's facing publishers, institutions, researchers, funders, etc. And the issues can range from paper mills, that's sort of fake authorship. Some of you might have come across this before. Image and data manipulation, generative AI, duplicate submissions and peer review, and the reproducibility crisis more generally. And you might have seen lots of things in the news or in discussions around this in recent years. There's some examples I've picked here of publishers who've had particular challenges with research integrity. And when it comes to that link between research integrity and open science, a lot of the systematic manipulation that we're seeing, some paper mills, etc., are often happening in open journals. And I'll talk a bit more about some of that link, but it isn't exclusive to open. This does happen across the board as well. Image and data manipulation is happening in lots of places. But this is becoming an increasing issue for publishers to face and to invest in, so that we can preserve the integrity of the scientific record. And in terms of the scale of the problem, this is a really interesting report from COPE and STM. For those of you who aren't familiar with these, this is the Committee on Publishing Ethics and the International Association of Science and Technology and Medical Publishers. They published a report last year looking exclusively at paper mills, which is a relatively new phenomenon. They looked at 53,000 papers across 6 publishers, across a range of subjects, and they found that most of the journals in the sample saw at least 2% suspected fake papers being submitted. And also, when they found that there was more, it sort of opened the floodgates, and there was a sharp increase of these papers being submitted. And one publisher found that they thought up to a quarter of its journals were at a substantial risk from paper mills. So it's a really huge problem. In this report, they found that frequently papers were in cellular and molecular biology that were at risk of, or potentially linked to, these paper mills, but this is changing all the time. So really, this is a small insight into a very big problem which all publishers are facing. So why is this happening? And I've got quite a cop-out of a subtitle here, which is, it's complicated, and it's not really a simple answer. But there are some well-discussed contributing factors, which I've listed here. The first of which I've already touched upon, which is research culture and research evaluation systems rewarding publication efficiency and scale. And these are things like the publish or perish culture within that for career progression, a real focus on publishing in high impact journals, driving that need to kind of be productive in terms of publication and sharing the number of publications. Also, the move to open access has embedded the pay-to-publish model into the transition, largely driven by article processing charges. And this has allowed predatory publishers to exploit this model and move into this space where there's a pay-to-publish transaction as part of a publishing process. As many of you know, researchers are under huge pressure to demonstrate productivity and impact. And so with that, there can become different practices which are perhaps look to reduce the burdens towards that productivity or impact, but can have problematic implications. And as I mentioned earlier, there's that publication bias through that favors positive results. So researchers have been disincentivized to share null and negative results and not report them. And this again can skew the record. So there's lots of things that are happening, and there are others that I've not mentioned here. It's a big issue, but it's worth kind of taking this into account. And all the things we're doing to promote open science, rapid publishing, dissemination of different research objects, we have to be careful that these don't kind of have unintended consequences of spawning kind of different behaviors. So these are things that publishers have to be mindful of. But open science is definitely part of the solution. Building transparency and greater validation is central to that. And that can only help us in mitigating some of these issues when it comes to research integrity and preserving the scholarly record. But we do need to be mindful of these unintended consequences. And as publishers, there's always much more that we can do. Publishers definitely have a key role in enabling open science, but there's also a responsibility in responding to these issues that are coming up, and they have arisen as part of it. And there's a real requirement for this to be handled with care and thoughtfulness and rigor going forward, as this is likely only to get more complex. So we've reached the summary, so you can all take a breather and it'll be time for Q&A shortly. But in summary, I realise there's been a lot of information I've crammed into this presentation, but in order to attempt to wrap up, I wanted to highlight some key points from the presentation. Firstly, open science does have the potential to accelerate research impact and return on investment. Many of you will, I'm sure, also share that view. But open science practices and behaviours, whether that's open access or data sharing, need to be incentivised and rewarded and easy to achieve for change to happen. Publishers play a key role in making open science practices possible, whether that is through enabling open access options with permissive licenses, open data, open peer review, responsible use of metrics. But collaboration is key for amongst stakeholders across the system, and it really needs system-wide thinking to deliver the promise of open science through researchers, publishers, funders, institutions, societies, the public, patient groups. I could go on. And then thinking about the challenges, continued monitoring and adapting is always needed when it comes to emerging challenges, opportunities and threats. How we can assure research integrity is a responsibility for all of the stakeholders, but publishers definitely have a big role to play in that, as I think they're at the sharp end of some of these things. But yes, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, questions, comments, feedback. So I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing so I can see you.
Thank you so much, Becky. I know I have some questions, but I'm going to open it up to the attendees first. That was a great overview, although some of the things were sad, like that word cloud you showed of researchers with some of the words that were largest is kind of sad to see, but not that surprising. Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions. And Becky, I think one of the things we were kind of most interested in was also any thoughts on what what people in this room think publishers can do to better support scientists and early career scientists in particular, right? So definitely opening it up for broader questions, but also if you have any thoughts on that, yeah. Steph?
Sorry, I was checking now. Zoom recognizes when you raise your hand.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. I've been thinking about this a lot. We talk a lot about recording everything, right? And giving credit for all of these things. But then again, we talk about dual publications as problematic. And I think we haven't really had this conversation of like, okay, if you're going to publish the methods and the grants and the paper, right? And I think it's great that people get credit for all of this, but I have a hard time sort of understanding how I, as a scientist in the future, will be able to find knowledge and use that knowledge, right? So I'll say that my favorite F1000 paper that I returned to is not what I would call a research paper at all, but a protocol, right? And as the software is updated, the protocol is updated as well, so it remains very current. I know that not all scientists continue to update their manuscripts, and so there's a couple of things, right? Like, how do I find knowledge? And when we make it open for continued updates, a record of versions, how do I compare something that's been updated to something that hasn't, and sort of figuring out how to use knowledge? Because at the end of the day, yes, we are scientists, right? This is our job, and this presents challenges that weren't baked into the scientific system early on. But on the other hand, like, if it's so hard to evaluate how good research is when it starts to be so much research, how do I find what I should be looking at?
Thank you, Steph. That is a whole load of really interesting ideas, and I will try to cover as many as I can, because I think they're really important issues. So thank you for raising those. So firstly, I've been jotting down, so tell me if I've not got them all. But firstly, to cover that, I think it's a really interesting question, that what is dual publication and what is kind of publishing different parts of the research process? Because I know that can be a concern. And I think things like salami slicing and dual publication are definitely kind of seen under the not recommended route of publishing, which is where you kind of take one piece of research and chop it up and publish it in multiple places. And you're duplicately submitting to lots of different publishers. Whereas what we're talking about in terms of different parts of the research process and publishing that is, it's not necessarily saying the same thing over and over again, but it is making sure that something is reproducible by giving it the space that it needs. So one of the things that we found, one of the main complaints, I guess, is the traditional research article has been a brilliant vehicle for sharing research for over 100 years, and that it gives that narrative overview, it gives you the hypothesis, what they found, the conclusion, everything's in one space, and it really gives you that kind of big picture of a long process, and lots of factors that have happened. But what we found is that lots of researchers and other people using that, one of the main complaints we had was that they didn't have enough information about the different parts of the process. They couldn't reproduce the methods based on the information because they had a paragraph to cover that. And inevitably, they couldn't really give as much as they'd want to give. And so what we've tried to do is to give researchers the opportunity to expand out and zoom in on certain parts of the process to aid that reuse and reproducibility. So if you design the methodology, you can do that, and then you can mention it in a research article later, but you're really giving it the space it's needed. Or if you're writing about data, you can do that. And the other thing that you mentioned, the sort of record of versions, version of record, and you mentioned protocols. I think it's a real shift in the view of the sort of version of record was heralded as the sort of the holy grail, I guess, is the point of reference, which is really helpful. But what is limiting about that is that it's a fixed thing in time. And really, as you say, research is not like that. It can evolve. And what the record of versions, or kind of the multiple reference points, tries to encapsulate is a recognition of that, and that things can evolve. And so with the digital publishing era, it's allowed us to experiment with some formats. So you mentioned the protocol. We also have experimented with living systematic reviews on F1000. And so, for example, we published an article about the Zika virus, which could update as more research was coming up about that, and would pinpoint on a map where those pieces of research were coming from. That couldn't happen with a fixed version of record, but it can happen if you kind of use digital technology to allow that evolution in a space. And obviously that needs to be peer reviewed and that needs to be validated, but so there are parameters. But I think that's the sort of the toss up between the two. And I think there's absolutely still space and need for research articles in that format, but it allows for other ways to share research. And then I'm just looking at I think, did I answer all the questions there? I can't remember if you had another one, Steph.
Yeah. I just think it's worth pointing out that my problem with the record of versions is that they don't all get the same attention. Yeah.
Yes.
So the first one might be very reliable, but there's very few people checking on what happens later, right? And at the time that you go to read a paper, you're not going to see the version that was peer reviewed. You're going to see the most modern version. And so I think that's super problematic because the most modern version is not science. Yeah, it's not been peer reviewed. So it's and so it's all, I think this is something that we really still need to think about because it sounds really good, but it can make I do think that the peer review process is the end of the scientific process. And once we start blurring those lines, it's a blog post, right? And so it becomes super dangerous. Even we saw with COVID, right? When journalists started going to read preprints, that they had a very hard time distinguishing, good research from bad. And so I think that this is something that requires a lot of work still. But maybe I think other people should speak as well. I don't want to take this over.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I'll just say very quickly on that and go to the next question that that's a huge problem in terms of validation and understanding, especially with preprint servers, like you say, in COVID. And something we're doing as a publisher is to try and be more transparent in some of the checks that we have in our process. So when we publish something before peer review, it has actually gone through quite a substantial amount of checking it's not plagiarized, checking it has the data, checking that all the ethics are in place. So it's really kind of each step ensuring that it's something that's sound. And so we're trying to have those more transparently available, but obviously that's at the moment it's difficult to do that when you've got that peer review process happening later. But yeah, I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think transparency and clarity is like a big, a really important step. Hanjo, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a very trivial question, I guess, which is, one thing that I feel publishers can do, and especially in the digital era, is become more efficient and publish at lower costs per item than they used to. And I feel that often open access publishing serves as a vehicle for many publishers, not F1000 explicitly, other publishers, to siphon off as much profit as they can while reducing their own costs, and then at the end, taxpayers pay the bill. And my impression, F1000, I've seen it when I was a PhD student. You started at the same time. I was really, really enthusiastic about this platform because you seem to do everything well, and everything you told us today is like state of the art. And so I wonder, what is your experience? What is the appropriate cost that we as researchers and taxpayers should estimate to pay on an item? And where do you see like potential for other publishers to maybe become more streamlined or become more efficient in their publishing so that the costs for researchers, and I mean, I am part of the privileged community. It's very easy for us to publish in Germany where I am, but great parts of the world, they don't have any access to money for publishing. And so whatever money they spend on publishing is lost elsewhere in the system. And so, yeah, so just what do you feel publishers can do better in that area?
That is a really good question. And it's like the holy grail, I think, in terms of cost. And that's a big challenge for publishers as well in terms of this and all parts of the research system, obviously, because there's a big cost burden that's happening elsewhere. How do you move to open science and how do you move to open access in a way that is not hugely expensive, but also supports the various things that need to happen? And for F1000, we, as you said, maybe you didn't mention this, but we are completely transparent about our APCs. We have a breakdown of what each of those costs are, whether that goes into the typesetting, the technology, editing, editorial checks, whatever that might be. We break that down. And it's in some ways relatively easier for us as a born only open access publisher to sort of break it down like that. And not all publishers do in any way do that. And I think for the big legacy publishers, it's really challenging for them to break down those costs when they have huge economies of scale across different ways of them producing this piece of research. And I know Nature, for example, were in a highly controversial situation a few years ago when they released their article processing charges, which were very high. And their reasoning was around the amount of submissions they get and the amount of editorial teams they need to support all of this. So it's quite difficult to compare like for like between publishers. And I wish I could give you this is the unit cost of producing an article, but I think it's really complex and hard to do that. And I think especially towards the end of my presentation, where I was talking about the rise in research integrity issues, this needs teams to look at it. It needs technology to look at these things. It's an increasingly, there are increasing costs, I guess, around that in terms of ensuring that we don't inadvertently publish a load of fraudulent or not kind of thoroughly worked through research, and that obviously questions the integrity of the scholarly record. So I think I haven't got an answer for you, I'm afraid, in terms of what the cost is, other than I think it needs looking at too. And I think the unit price of an article processing charge that's been baked into a move to open access and read and publish agreements, it has inequities in its own right and has problems there where it sort of moves the burden from inability to read to inability to publish. And so that's something as publishers we really need to think about in terms of how do we go beyond the transformative agreement? What's next there? How can we enable people to publish with us openly in a way that supports publishing but also doesn't cost out loads of people? So yeah, I think the answer is ongoing there, I'm afraid, but I think it's a big issue and a key issue. Martin, should I go to your question? You've been patiently waiting.
Yeah, that would
Yes,
be great.
I would like to follow up on research integrity. No, lots of people talk about research integrity. Very few people take it seriously. In particular, many research funders don't. And that's a big concern. Now I'm thinking about, at the level of peer review. Peer review actually provides a qualitative assessment of research work, or it should, particularly looking at the experimental design, including controls and methods, that they are adequate, that results are presented accurately, and conclusions are justified and supported by the data. And I'm actually quoting from a report of the Global Young Academy, which directly quotes F1000 on these criteria. So it's kind of weird that there's a qualitative assessment and then we throw it away and people look at bibliometrics, which I think doesn't make much sense. So, but concretely, what should we do to really push or give research integrity more consideration at each stage and to each level? And people talk about these big failings, but there are lots of small failings in papers. People come with exaggerated conclusions that are not backed up by the data. Lots of publications like that. They use methods that just don't make any sense. How do we better to flag this up?
That is also a really good question. And I think if we knew the answer to that completely, we would be solving all of our issues right now. But I think I can give my perspective on it, I think. And I agree about peer review. I think it remains one of the really kind of thorough, qualitative ways of assessing research. The problem is, and one of the ways in which was opening up peer review, it kind of shows the process behind it. It lifts the lid on it, which is great, because when it's double blind peer review, it can be really hard to know what has been said about this, whether someone has given a thorough report or they were the expert in the area. You're relying on this happening. But open peer review has its own complexities too. But when it comes to research integrity and kind of what can we do, I think kind of going back to the slide I had on sort of why is this happening, I think the big major change would be sort of changing the incentive structures and changing the way that researchers are evaluated. And this varies globally, so it's really difficult to do it in a large scale. So we know that researchers in certain countries are incentivized in different ways to others, and institutions may have their own perspectives and policies within this. But I think while there is the sort of incentive on productivity measured by the number of publications and the volume of publications, that inevitably will lead to problematic practice. And it doesn't mean that the researchers have gone out there thinking, oh yes, I'm going to deliberately do this. But I feel like in some cases it's been the pressure has come down, and in order to progress, you're looking for ways to shortcut, or you're looking for you're only wanting to share the research that shows the most novel or impact things. And so I think that's a major shift, and that's partly what kind of Dora and GYA are trying to sort of shift that big, huge discussion around research evaluation. But I think there is responsibilities everywhere in the system. I think within universities, there's training that can be done for kind of practices. I guess the question Steph said at the beginning, what's duplicate submission and what's sharing different parts of the process? There's lots of different things there. And I think particularly with generative AI, there's a real grey area there around what's appropriate use of things like ChatGPT increasingly. And I think for publishers, we have a responsibility for safeguarding. So really investing in systems that can try and track some of these and to safeguard against this and provide our own training. But I think we just need to kind of keep in touch across the whole system, because that's really where knowledge is best going to be shared. So I think there's no one simple answer, but I'd be interested in what you think.
How do we flag up and make it more prominent and act upon publications that are simply not good? Well, people cite 200 times, and how do we tell them, oh, you're actually citing complete nonsense here, because this paper claims that, and they actually don't show it. There is absolutely no data to support that claim. And it's in the literature, and people build upon it, and people build on foundations that are not solid. And people waste lots of time on that. So I know in particular in my field, the most cited publication over the last 10 years is fundamentally flawed on at least 10 points. And nobody wants to listen to me whenever I tell them.
Well, I mean, I think there must be multiple examples of this as research changes, but you're quite right. And I think that's what retraction is there for. Publishers do retract research that has found to be fundamentally flawed in retrospect or at the time of publishing. But it's a last resort. I think publishers absolutely don't want to be sort of retracting here, there, and everywhere. It's really if there is no other option. But yeah, it may be worth flagging to the publisher.
So something I like about Wikipedia. Wikipedia has a talk page.
Yes.
And I always read the talk page with the article. So any points that are controversial are typically flagged up. You hardly see this on scientific articles. Why not?
That is true. Good question. And I will say, I know Steph wants us to end, but F1000 does have commenting functionality. So you could do that if you wanted to. But this is not really wide practice that I'm aware of. But yeah, it's a really, really important issue. Steph, I'll pass to you. I know we're at time.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I actually didn't want to cut it off. I wanted to comment on what you guys were saying. We can cut it off. I'm just going to stop recording. We can continue. But what I wanted to say is I had a really interesting conversation with an editor, actually during the AGM with the +1 editor. And we were discussing how AI might change the peer review process. And what she had brought it down to was You know, if we use AI for peer review, at what point should we not use AI for peer review? Which parts are necessarily human? And I thought it was very interesting. She said the part that's necessarily human is the judgment on the truth of interpretation, on the trustworthiness of the interpretation, right? So everything else at this point can probably be assessed by AI, but when it comes to how well the data is interpreted, this is where the real meat of the paper might be in the future. From the researcher's perspective, this might be their job, because otherwise they're publishing a data paper. So the interpretation is where the real value is. And I think, Martin, that if peer review slowly moved to just an evaluation of the veracity and trustworthiness of the interpretation, a lot of this would change, right? Because you're not tasked with saying, did they sample, you know, like more than anyone else? This is not the question. Sometimes I think a lot of these articles that you're mentioning, it's because there's a lot of hand waving. And if you told a peer reviewer, listen, sit down, and all you have to do is tell me, do you think the interpretation of this data is good? Then I think that would end a lot of this sort of, problematic science.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think there's great strides to be made with AI when it comes to peer review. It's not all for the bad. I think there's some definitely interesting applications we can make with that. But I'm afraid I do have to go. I've got another call, but it's really, really great talking to you all, meeting you all, and thank you for such a interesting discussion after the session.
Thank you for presenting.
No problem at all. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Everyone have a nice weekend. See you next month.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.